So melee and close combat in 9th edition, has it got stronger or has it got weaker? Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel, where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. Today we're here to focus on close combat in 9th edition, which I thought would be quite an interesting topic to make a video on, seeing as we've just got so many rules that either buff or nerf it compared with its previous version in 8. In this video I'm going to try and summarise the biggest nerfs and buffs to close combat armies, and maybe try and make a bit of a balanced decision as to whether or not I think that melee will be stronger in 9th. I would just like to caveat this by saying that we don't know the points changes for a lot of these units yet. Obviously, if all melee units randomly go up by 20% extra in points cost, or go down by 10% in points cost, compared with their shooting counterparts, that is of course going to be an enormous factor. Today though, we're just going to focus on the actual mechanics of the game and how they've changed. So I thought I'd start out by talking about all the things that I think have hurt close combat armies the most in 9th edition, of which I think possibly the most impactful might be the fact that multi-charges are far harder than they were before. In 8th edition, you could be fairly unrestricted with the amount of targets you declare as charges, provided they're all within 12 inches, and the only real downside of doing so was taking more overwatch on your charging unit. In 9th edition, you need to be very careful about declaring multi-charges, as it means that if you can't reach any one of your targets to the charge and actually put a model within engagement range, then it means that the entire charge fails and you won't get into close combat with anyone. This is going to make people very skittish about declaring charges against longer, further away targets now. It's usually going to be more sensible just to guarantee a much more likely charge on a nearby unit, and maybe wipe that one out and overkill it, compared with gambling for more, and risking your fancy tooled up melee units not being able to do any damage whatsoever in the combat phase. In the fight phase you can only hit targets that you declared a charge on, or ones that have done a heroic intervention into you. So basically this change to multi-charges is going to mean you're either going to be restricted to fewer options that you can hit in the fight phase, or you're going to have a lower chance of making the same charge. Particularly for Death Star type close combat units, maybe things like Blood Angels Death Company or Raven Guard Assault Centurions who could happily take out several units in one turn. This really is quite a hefty nerf. Next we have the fact that vehicles can shoot in melee now, as can monsters, which means that locking up vehicles, particularly ones packing a load of anti-infantry firepower, might not be as good an idea as it was before. I suspect on the whole vehicles will go up a few points to account for this, but it basically means that you're going to need a fairly durable combat unit to charge a vehicle if you're not thinking about killing it this turn, particularly if the vehicle that you're charging is packing heavy flamers or something like that. This is going to be far more relevant against some vehicles rather than others. Things like Land-Based Crusaders sporting a load of assault cannon shots and hurricane bolter shots are going to be particularly worrying targets for some units, where things like a Space Marine Vindicator tank is not really a big deal at all because that's got a blast weapon that can't fire in close. It just means that you might have to think about locking up these vehicles a little bit more, although admittedly this could help some combat units, particularly big walkers packing heavy guns and close combat weapons, things like Invicta Tactical Warsuits or Redemptor Dreadnoughts for example. Possibly one of the biggest changes for the armies it affects are the nerfs to large units that we've seen in 9th. For some reason hordes have been hit especially hard with the 9th rules changes. They're far more susceptible to blast weapons, particularly if they're 11 or more in strength. Unit coherency can be a real issue, meaning that you can't do quite as many gamey combat shenanigans such as conga lining your guys out to be able to tag multiple targets or chain back to auras. And the coherency rules can be quite restrictive as well when you're trying to declare charges and making sure that no one is left exposed. On top of all that, the engagement range changes means that you either need to be within 1 inch of the enemy, or within half an inch of a model that's within half an inch of the enemy, which means if you maximally cluster up towards the enemy, you're only ever going to be fighting in a maximum of 2 ranks now, where you could potentially be getting up to 3 or 4 in 8th edition rules with the within 1 inch of 1 inch rule. All of these combined really deal a massive heavy blow to many common close combat units, things like Chaos Demons in large units, Orc Boys, and certainly won't help big units like Possessed Bombs, large units of Genitalia called Acolytes, or large units of Tyrannid Swarms. In general, the vast majority of these Horde type units do tend to be melee units, and the way it shakes out I think it's undeniable that these guys have suffered a pretty hefty nerf going into 9th edition. I honestly do hope that their points costs haven't gone up much to help balance things out, but at this point in time it doesn't seem particularly likely, seeing cultists go up from 4 points to 6, which was a crazy nerf in comparison to other things. In general, I think for melee armies and shooting armies, it does seem that taking smaller units with fewer than 10 models in does seem like it could be the way to go if all points stay fairly similar. Next we had Desperate Breakout. The one that allows surrounded models and units to fall back from a unit that surrounded them in close combat, which was a really powerful tool that melee armies had in their toolbox, and to be fair still do. I think there are times when that could actually make a big difference to a game, but to be honest, unless it is going to make a big difference to a game, I don't suspect that your opponent will want to use it unless they really have to. It gives them extra casualties on the unit that's doing it, the unit that's doing it can't make any other actions that turn whatsoever, and it also costs 2 command points. It's still very much going to be worth try-pointing and surrounding enemy units, but it might just not be quite as game deciding as it was before. By making your opponent pay command points or fail to shoot at the unit, then you're kind of winning either way. And if you do manage to try-point 2 different units on 2 parts of the battlefield, then it's only possible to use this stratagem once, meaning that you will be guaranteed to lock something up. Another few minor things are the smaller disembark radius from transport vehicles. They now have to get out wholly within the radius, which might limit charges just a little bit when they're coming out of transports. The changes to command rerolls I think are probably a nerf as well. Rather than being able to reroll 1 dice out of a failed charge roll, you now need to reroll both, so you can't just say, I've got a very high score on 1 dice, I'll reroll the other one for a hopefully better result. You now need to reroll the whole thing. In general, I think that will hurt more than it helps, but it does mean that if you do, say, roll snake eyes for a charge, then you might still have a chance of making a long charge if you do CP reroll and you reroll both dice. The character targeting rules change I think is probably also a small nerf to melee, just because melee units often want a whole bunch of characters running forwards with them, and now characters can be far easier to shoot unless they're right next to another unit, and it is a bit harder to guarantee that sort of protection if your units are trying to make charges. Some of them might pass the charge and some might fail, leaving your characters exposed, and in general it is a bit of a boon to the shooting armies. So those are some of the main nerfs as I see them, but of course melee has received a whole ton of buffs. One of the main ones is that Overwatch is now very limited indeed, unless you do happen to be fighting the Tau. Going from an innate ability of everyone to just a 1 command point stratagem for the majority of armies will certainly lead to less people being gunned down as they make the charge, and it could be particularly helpful for more fragile melee units such as these Death Company, who aren't the toughest point for point, but they pack a massive punch. I'm not sure that the less Overwatch does 100% make up for the multi-charge nerf, but it's certainly a really big asset and no mistake. Next we have the new terrain rules, which are pretty much a flat nerf to shooting. Obscuring ruins mean that there's more places to hide on the table than there were before. It might mean that you might be able to have melee units that are just completely impossible for a large part of your opponent's army to target. Their interactions are a little bit clunky, meaning that you'll have to be behind them rather than in them, but I think at least some of the time it will definitely change games. Possibly even easier to access though, at least for infantry, swarms and beasts, is the -1 to hit from dense cover. This one's a lot easier to acquire for any one unit, either have an infantry unit behind it or in it, or even vehicles that are partially obscured I believe get the -1 to hit now. Again, this will definitely lead to people taking less casualties from shooting, which in itself means a buff to melee strength. Melee units also interact with terrain just a little bit better as well. The change to engagement range doesn't mean 1 inch horizontally, but it also means 5 inches vertically as well. This now cuts down on the scenario where you might not be able to get units in combat due to another unit entirely packing up a middle floor ruin, and perhaps even more importantly, it means things like Dreadnoughts or Imperial Knights will now be able to engage units on middle floor ruins directly in close combat. A really big boon to things that can't climb ruin floors, things like cavalry and bikes as well. While vehicles can shoot in close combat, now fly vehicles and fly units in general can no longer fall back and shoot, which means that locking them up is now a far more viable tactic than before. In particular, some units lost out big to this, things like Space Marine Inceptors, who previously could pretty much guarantee their shooting every single turn. Inceptors in particular did go down in points to reflect this, but being able to really easily restrict their shooting is certainly no bad thing. Next we have the changes to Heroic Intervention, which I think is both a buff and a nerf to melee armies, depending on whether or not it was a major thing for your army in question. Previously the rules were just a little bit weird, meaning that if your opponent charged with a unit and then didn't declare a character as a charge, and then that character heroically intervened into them, then they wouldn't be able to target that character with their charging unit. That's no longer the case now, so in general people will be heroic intervening less into charging enemy units, just out of fear of their character getting killed before they even manage to do any damage whatsoever. Might be a small nerf this one if you are playing things like Space Wolves or other armies with easy heroic interventions, such as Blood Angels with the stratagem, but if you're just using more normal close combat units, it does mean that you won't have to worry as much about enemy characters heroically intervening when you do put your scary melee unit in combat with their gun line. In general though, in addition to less Overwatch and terrain rules, the third and perhaps most important buff to melee units is the way that missions and the game work now. Firstly, games are shorter, only being 5 turns in length, and in the Eternal War missions at least, objectives are usually scored progressively, acquiring points on each turn. In general, I think that the shorter game time is actually a really big buff to armies that want to go forward and get stuck in, compared with more traditional shooty gunline armies that typically want to castle at the back for a few turns, destroy your army, then move forward to claim the remaining objectives in the next few turns. For example, if you had a game of 8th edition where a gunline army would have to sit at the back for the first 4 turns and kill most of their opponent's army, they could potentially have turns 5, 6 and 7 to score objectives after that, but now they'll only have turn 5. It means that if you don't get stuck in, then you might let your opponent get to an insurmountable lead, so even if you did manage to wipe most of their army off the table, it might not even matter that much if you can't even score all the objectives. In general, I think even gunliney type armies are generally going to be wanting to throw some units into the midfield, which is great news for melee armies in general, and still give them something to charge, maybe wrap and trap, and maybe even gain movement via charging as they go up the board. On top of that, the objective placement in these new missions tends to revolve around the centre of the board, with measurements being done from there. Again, I think they're a little bit more skewed to being closer to the centre than they were previously, again, and this very much rewards melee armies and disincentivises people from sitting back in their own deployment zone. There's also some secondary objectives where you need to be within 6 inches of the board's centre. Anyone who's trying to go for those is certainly going to be putting themselves in easier charge range. There's also some secondaries that reward you for putting units in your opponent deployment zone or in different table quarters. Again, aggressive armies will find these a lot easier to do than more defensive ones. I know that the smaller board size is a minimum size only, but again, any games that are played on a 44 by 60 inch board will favour more close range shooting and melee armies over long range ones. Although armies will still set up the same amount of distance away from each other, it'll just mean that they have less room to run away to, or a less deep deployment zone to hide right at the back of, and it means that if you are moving your units up, it will take fewer turns for you to take your units from one end of the board to the other. Finally, for missions, strategic reserves are another decent option that a lot of armies I think will be making use of. Any slow melee units without a deep strike option could certainly make use of this. Guaranteeing a 9-inch charge on turn 2 is pretty nice, and if your opponent is brave and pushes up towards your deployment zone, then you might be able to directly start in close combat with them or something. Again, just another tool that you might be able to make use of to get units in combat. Finally, just another couple of minor things. I think that the cut them down stratagem in the book is really quite weak, but if you're using hordes in close combat, then admittedly that is one buff that they couldn't do before. Maybe used situationally for a last wound character falling back or something like that, to try and wipe them out with mortal wounds. Also, a lot of the releases for Marines from the Indomitors box are melee orientated, and I think that their rules seem fairly strong at the moment at least. So I wouldn't be surprised to see a fair few of them on the table in the near future, just because they're cool new models with fairly strong rules. So overall, for any given army, I do think melee might have got stronger or weaker, depending on which of these buffs are more important. Overall, I think that melee is actually stronger in 9th edition than 8th edition, the main differences being less overwatch and more terrain rules versus worse multi-charging and vehicle shooting in melee. But for me, the mission changes, the strategic reserves, the shorter game turn, they all swing it in favour of melee for me. I will say though that for more hoardy type melee armies, your traditional 30 orc boy mobs, large units of chaos bloodletters, that sort of thing, I think it's definitely going to be a lot more of a mixed blessing. I think in general we will see more elite close combat armies running around, rather than more hoardy type ones, at least in the short term at the start of 9th. Hopefully though, if hordes really do disappear from the meta, then Games Workshop might throw us a bone in a later chapter approved. So let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Do you think that your army will be easier or harder to use with the melee changes? And please feel free to highlight anything that I might have missed on these lists that are important factors for you. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics for more similar 40k content coming out every day. And if you have been enjoying my videos, I'd just like to mention that I do have a Patreon page for the channel, which you can find down in the video description. If you've been enjoying a lot of the videos, then any support is massively appreciated, as it is what allows me to keep on making them. Channel patrons get to see a video a week early, there's regular polls to see what sort of videos come next on the channel, and I also run regular monthly giveaways, which Patreon supporters are automatically entered into. If any of that sounds good, or you'd just like to help support the channel, the link is down in the video description, and of course a massive thank you to my current patrons for allowing this channel to happen. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.